Now, on the one hand, look, you got to appreciate with any country that supports your action and praises your actions and declares its solidarity with you. In this case, the U.S. statements are actually slightly complicating. Australia led out early with a call for an independent inquiry, and there's a lot of debate domestically here within Australia whether that was the right move. But the end result is now that 122 other countries have joined with us in calls for an independent inquiry. The United States has come relatively late in its support for that particular call. The United States has had a much more proactive and much more pre-conclusionary approach to the inquiry. And as a result, one wonders whether or not United States advocacy or support for an involvement of this particular call for an inquiry might actually doom it to failure as opposed to getting to go forward on a less partisan or less divisive basis. The other challenge that Australia really faces here is while U.S. support in terms of security is essential, where U.S. investment is essential to the Australian economy, when it comes to things like barley or other agricultural commodities, the United States is, to be honest, a competitor of Australia's. And so it's not really a country that can take our barley on behalf of China or our wine or our beef or other things going forward. And in fact, in many respects, there is some ongoing concern that one of the reasons that China is lashing out against Australia right now is just so that they can meet their targets reached in that preliminary agreement between the United States and China.
We've seen some positive news today. The Global Times, the newspaper in China, which is seen as a propaganda essentially for the China Communist Party, is suggesting today that it is time to repair the relationship. It said that it doesn't want to be the first to fire a bullet in any trade war with Australia. Just how much weight do comments in that paper really carry when we do see it as a sort of mouthpiece of Beijing? Do you see that as a positive sign that China could be ready to move on after weeks of these increasing tensions?
It is. There are also, if you look at what they said yesterday or the day before that, concerning signs. And so I wouldn't read too much into a Global Times editorial. They tend to be a harbinger of what the actual Chinese positions are, but don't line up entirely in that process. The important thing, I think, for Australia to realize is that we are not in this alone. We are now just one of 122 countries calling for the independent inquiry, and many countries are having the same issues. It is tempting for us to kind of look at this in the bubble and think that somehow we're the only country right now being targeted by China, whereas Korea or the Philippines or Brazil or a whole range of other countries are facing similar responses. This is really more about changes internally in China than it is about us, and yet our tendency is to interpret it entirely in our own domestic context.
Gordon, if we look at how the pandemic is playing out in the United States, we're seeing the death toll again continuing to rise. There's still some devastating scenes there in the United States. Donald Trump has made it very clear overnight who he blames. He's saying China is responsible for millions of deaths worldwide. But of course, he's got his own critics, doesn't he, about his handling of the pandemic. And America could have acted a lot earlier.
There's no question. The United States is now approaching 95,000 deaths and is doing so at a time where almost every one of the 50 U.S. states is pursuing some type of opening. And I have to say, countries like Australia or New Zealand or Korea or Taiwan or Singapore or Germany that have handled this in a very different way can't help but shake our heads in some form of bewilderment, because essentially the United States has given up on the response and decided to weather the cost in terms of lives. And so at this point, it seems inevitable that the mortality rate will continue to rise. The United States will be seeing certainly over 100,000, but probably well over 150,000 deaths by the time we get to August. And there will be consequences for that. In the U.S. current political climate, it's not entirely clear what they are. But it certainly is terrifying to watch outside of the U.S.
In terms of the political climate, obviously everyone's looking towards the November election. Are the polls suggesting that Americans have been appalled at the way Donald Trump has handled this? Is that being reflected in the public polling that's happening?
Yeah, so national level polls now showing a 10-point gap with Biden over Trump. But again, analysts like myself have been extremely cowed by our failures in 2016 and beyond. I think it's way too early to write off President Trump. So no question, the pandemic, the resulting economic impact has been bad for him. But it strikes me as bizarre that given the worst economy since the Great Depression, given approaching 100,000 American deaths, he still has 45% approval. Right? That just tells you the unique nature of the political divide and tribalism that exists in the United States. I don't think any other country I can think of in the world would face that negative a situation and yet have a contender like the president that still has that core base of support. It does appear to be eroding. We're just going to have to see how things play out in the intervening months. And all elections are about choices. And so part of it is going to be how strong of a candidate Joe Biden emerges as and who he picks as his running mate. And I think a lot of attention is going to be paid to that in the coming weeks.